And we're starting today's seminar in environmental and water engineering at University of California, Davis. My name is Thomas Harter. I'm a professor and professor of carbon extension in this program, and I am welcoming Justin Thompson. Justin received his PhD from the University of Texas at Austin, Jackson School of Geosciences, where our recently retired colleague, Graham Falk, has also been for many, many years. Justin's dissertation focused on Texas groundwater management and planning. He is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Texas Bureau of Economic Geology. His research interests lie in the nexus of hydrology, policy, and economics. So everything that you all here in this room represent. So he also holds an MA in Global Policy Studies, no surprise, from the University of Texas LB School of Public Affairs. Dr. Thompson was an international project finance professional prior to his graduate studies. He's proficient in Mandarin, ni hao, and has worked with nonprofits bringing groundwater and rainwater solutions to underserved communities in East Africa. So lots of good stuff, lots of good things to talk about. And the topic of his talk today is groundwater recoverability, as in affordability, right?
That's one angle.
Justin, welcome. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. Sorry for not being able to have you here. Take it away.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today during your lunch hour. And thank you for inviting me to give this presentation. And thank you, Thomas, for that kind introduction. Okay, so again, my name is Justin Thompson, and I'm going to talk to you today about groundwater recoverability, specifically about new tools that could be used in managing groundwater sustainability. I'd like to preface and contextualize this talk a little bit by briefly discussing Texas groundwater management and planning and how it motivated these studies. So for that, I'm going to give you an ultra short crash course in Texas groundwater management, or what I'd like to call the alphabet soup of acronyms. So we start with groundwater conservation districts, or GCDs. These are our primary regulatory entities in Texas, and they're shown here in this map to the right in the gray shading. If you need to drill a well or pump from a well and you need a permit for that, these are the entities that you will apply to. We have about 99 of them in the state, and they're grouped together into what are called groundwater management areas, or GMAs. These are the numbered areas on the map here to the right here. And they're grouped together largely on the basis of the footprints of our major aquifers, which you can see in the colors in the map here. Okay, so our groundwater conservation districts within a GMA get together to adopt what are known as desired future conditions, or DFCs. Desired future conditions are basically a statement of what do we want our aquifer to look like over a planning period. Now, they take many forms, such as maybe spring flow metrics, but they're most commonly expressed as a depth to water change over time. So depth to water meaning, the depth of the potentiometric surface, right, or the water table in an unconfined setting. So a DFC, for example, might be something like, we want to see our depth to water increase by 25 feet over 50 years, something like that, right? Then, once the DFC is adopted, the districts permit pumping in such a way so as to achieve that desired future condition over the planning period. So given the sort of primacy of importance of these DFCs to groundwater management, let's take a quick closer look in how they come to be. Well, Texas water law says that when adopting DFCs, our groundwater districts are supposed to think about all of these things you see listed here. It's kind of a wide range of things, some of which are sort of conflicting with one another, right? Everything from the feasibility of achieving the DFC to interests and rights in private property, which is going to be different than folks in California. Groundwater here in Texas is privately owned by the overlying landowner. To say environmental impacts, right? Maybe to spring flows like we've got pictured here. But the two DFC considerations that I'm most interested in that we're talking about here today are these two at the bottom, right? Total estimated recoverable storage and the socioeconomic impacts reasonably expected to occur with that DFC. Let's look at each of those in a little bit more detail real quick. First, total estimated recoverable storage, or TERS. What is it? Well, it's currently Texas' best estimate of groundwater recoverability. It's two numbers. It's 25% and 75% of total storage. Total storage meaning we imagine we drain the aquifer completely, how much water would be produced. Now, these TERS reports would seem to indicate that there are potentially billions with B of acre feet recoverable in Texas. And this has got some people thinking somewhat loudly about what does this mean, right? They compare, for example, these billions of acre feet that are supposed to be recoverable according to TERS, and they compare that with, say, for example, the latest state water plan that anticipates a water deficits under drought of record conditions by 2070 of about 7 million acre feet with an M, right? And this has led these folks to, yes.
If I may interrupt for just a second, we're seeing your speaker screen, not the presentation screen.
Okay. Let's see here. How do I fix that? Let's see here.
Maybe duplicate your screens or something.
Is that right?
That's perfect.
Perfect. Okay, sorry about that. We'll
Perfect.
soldier on. Yeah, no, good. I'm glad you caught it. All right. So this has got some people thinking, right? Billions of acre feet recoverable according to TERS, and 7 million acre feet deficits under drought of record conditions according to the state water plan. So these people have started wondering loudly, are we experiencing a regulation-induced shortage of groundwater in Texas, right? Is the groundwater that's available under this DFC process just the tip of the iceberg of what could be recoverable? Well, maybe not. Among other things, TERS does not consider well performance constraints nor the economic feasibility of pumping that water. So speaking of economics, what about, now I can't advance my slide. There we go. What about that other DFC component that we talked about, the socioeconomic impacts reasonably expected to occur? Well, those are currently totally unquantified in Texas. Why? Well, the districts and the management areas say that no one has come up with a uniform quantitative analysis to address this issue. So they're currently using what they call a qualitative approach to think about this. So this leaves us with some questions. One, how could recoverability be better quantified, right? How could we perhaps do better than this 25%, 75% arbitrary TERS benchmarks? Two, how do storage conditions drive recoverability? Is that something we need to think about? And three, how might changes in depth to water impact our users? For example, what might those socioeconomic impacts of DFCs be? These are the questions that we'll explore today. Okay, so first, how could recoverability be better quantified? Well, our approach is in quantifying the hydroeconomic well performance changes with changes in depth to water. Kind of a mouthful, I know. So let's kind of break that down. What do we mean by that? Well, we're really thinking about two things. First, we're thinking about operational impacts. And the question that we're asking ourselves there is, can the well meet pumping demand without failing? Okay, so let's dive into that a little bit. How would we think about that? Well, what we really want to know is, how does the water level in the well behave under pumping? Right, so you've kind of got two components to that. You've got the depth to water, whatever it might be, and then you've got some pumping drawdown that's going to reduce that or increase the depth of the water level in the well, something beyond that depth, that initial depth to water. So we're imagining, okay, well, if depth to water increases, then there must be some depth to water where the water level in the well under that pumping drawdown intersects with the depth of the pump, in which case your pump burns up, or intersects with the depth of the top of the well screen, in which case your well screen starts to foul. So we can say, okay, we imagine that capacity then, in a sense, to meet your pumping demand without failing is going to decrease as depth to water increases. At a minimum, there's just less and less potentiometric head available to meet your pumping drawdown demand. And there may actually be an increase in your pumping drawdown as depth to water increases. We'll talk more about that in a second. Okay, so now that we have sort of this operational understanding of how the water level in the well behaves, what about the economics? Question here we want to ask is, are pumping and perhaps remediation costs affordable? Right? Remediation meaning, well, hey, if I hit one of these operational limits, can I drop the depth of the pump? Can I drill a deeper well? Right? That's going to have costs. So are those pumping and remediation costs affordable? Well, so here we're imagining that for one reason or another, as depth to water increases, your costs are going to increase. So there may or may not be some depth to water where these pumping costs become equivalent to what the user is willing to pay for the water. In that case, we can imagine that there's an affordability threshold in addition to the operational threshold. Now, one quick point I want to make is that with the methods that we're using here, we can do this kind of an analysis for any well pumping from any aquifer for any use. And we'll see more about that in just a second. Okay, so let's take a quick deeper look here into the operational side of things, right? We talked about how we're really interested in how the water level in the well behaves. How are we going to quantify that pumping drawdown? Well, there's a number of ways to do that. You could use a specific capacity approach, right? As Gailey did in his 2019-22 papers, and as we did in our 2020 paper. Now, if you're not familiar, specific capacity is a term that's usually reported in units like gallons per minute per foot of drawdown, right? So you could use this to kind of estimate based on your pumping demand what that drawdown might be. And it's a really handy term, specific capacity, because it's really easy to calculate understandable results from. And you can do that with just a piece of paper and a pencil. But specific capacity has some limitations that we're concerned with here, right? So for one thing, it's a specific capacity is generated from the pumping test of a given well under specific storage conditions. If either one of those two things change, for example, the well infrastructure changes, or you want to look at a different well, or the storage conditions in the aquifer change in such a way as to affect pumping drawdown, then you won't be able to use that specific capacity term anymore. You'll need a more advanced drawdown solution, like, for example, the TICE solution, which we have written out here. The TICE solution improves upon specific capacity because you can use it for pretty much any well, right? And importantly, it gives us drawdown as a function of time, right? Specific capacity is just a flat one number, right? You could think of it as the maximum drawdown over a pumping period. But TICE will give it to us as a function of time. We can calculate drawdown on a per minute of pumping basis, for example. The other thing that TICE does for us is I've got these T's highlighted here, right? I've got this whole equation written out, not to make myself look smart, but I want to point out these T's. These T's are highlighted because they stand for transmissivity. And probably a lot of folks here know transmissivity is just the product of the saturated thickness of the aquifer and the hydraulic conductivity. So why is this important? Well, if you're talking about an unconfined setting, where if depth to water is increasing, then saturated thickness is decreasing, then as depth to water increases, T is going to decrease. So that means this pumping drawdown will actually get bigger and bigger and bigger as depth to water increases and saturated thickness declines. So TICE is a decent approach, but it also has some limitations. Notably, TICE assumes that the full saturated thickness of the aquifer is screened. Now that might be a reasonable assumption in a confined setting, but it almost certainly isn't reasonable in an unconfined setting. And, so we want to think about, well, what is the impact of partially penetrating well infrastructure on this drawdown curve? So for that, we need yet another drawdown solution, even more complex. We're going to use, in this case, the Harter solution. And again, I've got it written out here, not just to make the mathophiles happy, but I want to point out all of these terms that I have highlighted here, which are either a function of that depth to water or that well infrastructure, right? Now, the key thing to take away from Harter is that basically, where all else is held constant, a longer well screen interval is going to result in a shallower pumping drawdown, and a smaller well screen interval will result in a deeper pumping drawdown. And that's kind of the key takeaway there. Okay, so we've talked about the operational side, right? What about the economic side? How are we thinking about pumping costs? Well, we separate them out into three components. First, we've got lifting costs here, right? And lifting costs is just sort of the energy cost of lifting that water to land surface. And I've got it written out here because, again, I want to point out some parameters, right? So lifting costs are going to be a function of both your depth to water and your drawdown, S, right? And so what we see in this equation, right, we're calculating that drawdown on a per minute basis using that TICE solution in part. And then we're converting all of that to power and multiplying that by a price of power, and then distributing that out over the production volume to come up with a sort of dollars per volume basis that we can then compare against that willingness to pay dollars per volume. Similarly, equipment, that's the cost of your pump itself, right? Which is also going to be a function of depth to water and your drawdown under pumping, which again, we're going to convert to power, right? Multiply by a price of power and then divide out over the production life of the equipment. Drilling and installation costs are a little bit different. If you want to just say, hey, this is what I paid for my well, you can just plop that in and then we can divide it out over the life and production volume to come up with that dollars per volume. Or you can go with a price approach and tell us what the local prices for drilling, usually on a per foot basis, are in your local area. And then we can multiply that by the depth of drilling, which we'll kind of come back to here in a minute. We mentioned a minute ago remediation costs, right? If you need to drop the depth of your pump or drill a deeper well, those are going to have costs too, right? Equipment or drilling costs, which we'll use kind of the same approach for. Okay, so that's kind of the operational and the affordability approach. But then, we just kind of talked about how we recognize that the well infrastructure itself has an impact on the affordability threshold and the operational threshold. So we kind of wondered, well, could wells be optimized to maximize these thresholds? Spoiler alert, we think so. So the approach we came up with for that on the operational side is sort of straightforward. The idea is to minimize that partially penetrating Hantouche drawdown, right, at depth to water, which is a function of depth to water and the screen interval, right, plus the screen interval itself, right, which is a little tricky computationally speaking, but we can get it done. And so the idea here in the simplest example is to say, well, if we increase the well screen interval by a foot, does that reduce the pumping drawdown by more than a foot, thereby resulting in a net increase to the operational threshold depth to water? That's kind of how we envision the operational side of the optimization. The affordability side is a little bit more complex. There, the idea is to minimize the sum of all of our pumping costs, right? And so, of course, our lifting and equipment costs are both functions of depth to water and that drawdown, which is, of course, itself a function of the well infrastructure. And then the drilling depth, right, which is, again, a function of the well infrastructure. So to do that, we evaluate all kinds of well screen intervals and placements within the aquifer to kind of minimize those costs at the maximum possible depth to water. Again, increasing theoretically that affordability threshold. Okay, so we've talked about methods, we've talked about our approach, and now we want to apply it. Let's talk first quickly about the study area.
Justin, if I may interrupt just briefly, can you go back to your last slide and again talk about the operational limits to make sure that's clear how it goes in your optimization?
Yeah, so again, we've got some depth to water today, whatever it might be. And we're imagining on the operational side, there's got to be some depth to water where you're going to experience a well failure, right? But because pumping drawdown, right, is a key component of that calculation, we know that pumping drawdown is affected by the well construction. So we could optimize what the well construction looks like to make that operational threshold as deep as it could be. So for example, right, go back here, right, I showed this very large pumping drawdown, right, with a somewhat smaller well screen. Well, the idea is to say, okay, well, maybe if we make the well screen longer, the pumping drawdown gets smaller, right, and the pumping drawdown decreases by more than the screen increase. So that results in a net increase in how deep we can go in this depth to water without the well failing, right? That's the operational side of it. The affordability side, the calculation itself is more complex. It requires quite a lot of iteration and Python logic, but the idea is the same, right? It's to say, well, how can we adjust the well infrastructure in such a way that we can meet our demand, right, without the well failing, but we can minimize the costs in such a way that we can get to this depth to water that is the deepest it can be before we start, being in the red and losing money. Make sense?
Makes sense now. Yeah.
All right. Rock on. Okay. So now that we've talked about sort of methods and approaches, we want to see some results. We want to try it out. Let's talk quickly about our study area that we applied these methods to. We looked at the Carrizo-Wilcox Aquifer and specifically the Carrizo-Wilcox within the Post Oak Savannah Groundwater Conservation District. So why Carrizo-Wilcox Aquifer? Well, first and foremost, perhaps, it stores quite a lot of water, about 5.2 billion acre feet. By storage volume, it is the largest aquifer in the state of Texas, and in fact stores 45% of all major aquifer storage in Texas. 5.2 billion acre feet, as kind of a point of reference, is about 53% of the volume of Lake Superior. And so we've kind of got it mapped out here. You can see the solid reds. That's the outcrop area. The hatching is the subcrop. And then in yellow here is our study area, which we'll talk more about in just a second. I've got just the quick stratigraphy for you here, where I've highlighted the water-bearing formations in blue. You can see the Sparta sand and Queen City sand, which are minor aquifers in Texas. And then the Carrizo-Wilcox itself is composed of 4 formations: the Carrizo Sand, Calvert Bluff, Simsboro, and Hooper formations. We actually looked at all 4 of these formations in the central area, but for the sake of time today, I'm just going to show you results for the Simsboro, which is one of the more productive and heavily exploited formations of the Carrizo. Okay, so why Carrizo? Check mark. What about why Post Oak Savannah Groundwater Conservation District? Well, for one thing, it gives us a nice set of varied storage conditions, right? Recalling that question 2, how do storage conditions drive recoverability? Well, here along the northwest terminator, right, we've got sort of shallow and unconfined settings, and then down toward the southeast of the district, we've got very deep and confined settings. So we've got a nice range of storage conditions to look at here. Number 2, the Vista Ridge Pipeline Project, which pumps from a well field right about here, supplies water to the city of San Antonio, about 100 miles away. And it pumps about 50,000 acre feet per year, came online in, I think, late 2019, and pumps more water from the district than every other user in the district combined. Perhaps in part in light of the Vista Ridge Pipeline Project, the very recently released 2021 desired future conditions for this district reflect a 50 to over 100% increase in depth to water for the Carrizo-Wilcox. And that's what we've got pictured up here, right? So for example, the Simsboro formation from the desired future condition is to increase depth to water by 278 feet. So from 2010, the average depth of water was 256 feet. That's going to go up at the end of the planning period to 534 feet, to basically more than double in depth. Just a quick note I want to make here in this blue shading here, this is the Texas Water Development Board's aquifer characterization model footprint that we were kind of talking about before the talk got going. And we're going to use that model to characterize the aquifer in this study as well. The last reason we looked at Post Oak Savannah is they actually have what's called the Groundwater Well Assistance Program, or GWAP, which we thought was kind of interesting. There's sort of a recognition that these desired future conditions are, fairly impactful. So this program says that if your well experiences a failure, then you can apply to this program for, financial offsets for that failure. Okay, so that's our study area. Now let's get into actual real results, and we're going to address first that question 2, how do storage conditions drive recoverability? For this, we're going to take kind of a TERS approach. We want to deliberately kind of compare and contrast a little bit with that TERS number. So what we're going to look at is we're going to look at recoverable storage yields. And for that, we're looking at a pretty simple yield calculation. It's your surface area multiplied by either that operational threshold or that affordability threshold minus what the depth to water was before, multiplied by a storage coefficient, right? So it's the same thing as that total storage, only now we're not imagining draining the aquifer completely. We're just imagining draining it to either of these thresholds to see how much water would be produced. And those storage coefficients are going to be important, right? We'll talk about why in just a second. Sort of recognizing what we were talking about a minute ago with that, optimized well infrastructure, we said, well, we want to think about how much could really be recoverable. Then let's look at model optimized well infrastructure. So that's what we're doing here. We're imagining that there's a model optimized well pumping from each model cell, which is a 1 square mile resolution. I already mentioned that we're taking our aquifer characteristics from the board's model. And for this example, we kind of went with an agricultural kind of setting. So we're looking at a pumping rate of 70 gallons per minute, willingness to pay of $100 per acre foot, price of power, 10 cents per kilowatt hour, and a well efficiency of 75%. So here, this is the same. This is our study area, right? This Post Oak Savannah Groundwater Conservation District. It's actually 2 counties, Milam County and Burleson County. And this red here is kind of a loose, honestly, not very good in some senses, representation of where the aquifer is in outcrop conditions. So don't memorize it, but just kind of keep this shape and its location in your mind for a second. Okay, so now the good stuff. All right, so what are you looking at here? So this is operational yields, right? So this is how much water could be produced if you drained the aquifer to that operational threshold for each one of these model grid cells. You can see it ranges quite a bit from, about a half an acre foot to over 56,000 acre feet. We've got some white cells here along the northwest terminator that even at this initial depth to water, pumping is not possible, right? You can't pump without hitting your pump, right, burning up your pump, for example. And so here we see, according, at least in this analysis with these parameters, about 73% of the total aquifer storage is recoverable. Not bad. It's actually not that far off from that 75% TERS benchmark, right? But what about the affordable yields? Ooh, okay, well, those are quite a bit different, right? So first and foremost, I told you to keep in mind the shape of that red blob, right? Oh, looky there. It's kind of right along the same area where we're seeing our high economically affordable yields, right? So what is this showing you? Okay, so we've still got those white cells where it's not operationally possible to pump. And then we've got this band of higher yields and then a whole big area down here of relatively low yields, right? So, well, what's going on? Well, I told you that those storage coefficients would be important, right? Well, what you're seeing here in these hotter colors is where the affordability threshold, right, that depth to water, is falling somewhere within the saturated thickness of the aquifer. So in that case, the yield storage coefficient is going to be, a specific yield, which in this case for this aquifer is 0.15. Whereas down here, the affordability threshold depth to water is falling somewhere in the pressure head of the aquifer. So all of the water that's being produced in the yield calculations down here is coming from a storativity storage coefficient, which in this case is 0.0003. Right, so orders of magnitude smaller than that specific yield. And so that's why, even though there is some variability down here, in this scale, it pales in comparison to these hotter colors up here. Okay, so that's just kind of a quick look-see. Now let's look at what's actually driving these yields, these thresholds. So on the operational side, this is what you just saw a second ago. This is the operational yields, right, at each model grid cell. And now here to the right, this is the aquifer saturated thickness. And you can just already tell kind of immediately, just visually, like, wow, there's clearly a relationship there. I mean, you could almost convince me that that's, the same image. It's not, right? It is, in fact, 2 different things. But what this is showing you just visually is what we're also seeing over here numerically. That the saturated thickness of the aquifer itself is really the key driver of the yield, right? And so that's what we show here. The red line is the operational threshold yield, and the blue line is the saturated thickness. The total head, by contrast, which you might be forgiven for thinking was maybe a key driver, is kind of somewhere over here, right? Doesn't really track very well. Okay, so that's the operational side. What about the affordable side? Well, this one is a little bit harder to see, but we already kind of went through it, right? We've got the hot colors down here in this band. And to help you see, so this middle guy, this is aquifer bottom depth, and to help kind of see what we kind of already saw with the red blob, is I've overlain in gray where the aquifer is in confined settings. So you can see that the hot band of high yields falls along the area that is unconfined or that has as little enough pressure head that the affordability threshold can fall within the saturated thickness of the aquifer itself. And again, that's kind of what we're showing over here numerically. The red line, the affordable threshold yield, this kind of looks wonky, right? Because we have all these really small yields and then, just that line of hot colors. But what's more telling here is the blue line, right, which is the aquifer bottom depth, and the green dash line, which is the depth of the affordability threshold. You can see that those sort of track nicely with one another. Okay, so if we understand a little bit about how storage conditions drive recoverability, now we want to answer and look at that third question, right? How might changes in depth of water impact our users? So let's start with that by kind of looking at the same yield optimized infrastructure we looked at before. And here we're not looking at yields, we're looking at the depths of those affordability and operational thresholds. So here's the operational threshold at the initial 2010 depth to water. That's the calibrated depth to water from the board's model that the local desired future conditions are measured from. All right, so again, you kind of see quite a range here, right? 3 feet to as much as over 6,000 feet. So now we want to know, okay, well, how does this operational threshold depth change if we increase the depth to water in the district according to that desired future condition? We add 278 feet of depth. Well, really what happens is we get a new band of white cells. So you'll notice here, there were no white cells here. We cut away everything that couldn't pump at the 2010 depth to water. Now we've got a new band of white cells. All of these cells are places that at the given model parameters, it was feasible to pump at the 2010 depth to water, but now at the DFC depth to water, you're out of luck. Your well has failed. On the affordability side of things, right? So this is what we're looking at in terms of the depth of that affordability threshold at the 2010 depth to water. And this is kind of the corollary for what you just saw in the yields, right? You can see these great depth affordability thresholds that are falling down, within the saturated thickness of the aquifer and giving us those hot yields we saw a second ago. And then way down here, it's only 3 feet. Interestingly, even at these great depths of this aquifer bottom over, almost 6,500 feet, it was actually still economically feasible at these model parameters to pump, even from way down there. The affordability threshold depth may have only been, 3 feet from where it was at 2010, but it was feasible. Now at the 20 DFC depth to water, right, we've got the same band of white cells. It's physically infeasible to pump from. And now we've got a whole bunch of black cells that were economically feasible or affordable at 2010 and now aren't. And what I think is interesting about this result is it's not just this uniform band of black, right, that occurs when it starts to get really deep, but you've got these little pockets of black elsewhere, right, indicating that there is more than one sort of function to this, right? So for example, you might have maybe a very low hydraulic conductivity value here, for example. Okay, so that's an analysis of how this depth to water change would affect our users for hypothetical model optimized wells. What about existing wells? Well, for that, we looked at our submitted drillers report database, and we found that there were 451 wells within the district pumping from the Carrizo-Wilcox aquifer. 84% of those are domestic wells, 11% livestock, and 5% irrigation. And these are the only 3 types that we looked at. And so what we did is we said, okay, we used those methods that we looked at above, and we calculated how do pumping costs stack up for all of these wells within the district. And that's what we've got pictured here. We've got them kind of separated by color. The yellow stuff, that's our domestic users. The green stuff is our irrigation users. And the blue stuff is our livestock users. We've also separated out by those drilling cost components. So the light colors for each one are the drilling costs, right? Medium colors are the equipment, pump equipment, and the darkest colors is that lifting energy. And so one thing that I think is interesting here, we already see that there is sort of a difference in how these costs are distributed based on use type, right? So our domestic users are 84% of our tested wells, but they're only bearing 75% of these aggregate costs. By comparison, our irrigation users, right, only 5% of tested wells are bearing 11% of these costs. Why? Well, for one thing, our irrigation and to a lesser extent our livestock users simply pump more water than our domestic users do. But they also tend to have slightly deeper wells. Okay, so you put all this together and in aggregate, we find that at the 2010 depth to water, these 451 wells all together are spending an average of $253,000-ish per year. 83% of that for everybody is drilling costs, a little over $211,000. About 13% of that is lifting energy, right? About $33,000. So now if we want to know how is this desired future condition change in depth to water going to impact these users, what we're going to do is we're going to use the same methods, and we're going to recalculate these costs at the DFC depth to water, and we're going to take the difference between the two and consider that the change in costs. And that's what we have here. So first, a quick note about remediation. We talked briefly about the fact that we do consider remediation for wells that fail. We found that 9% of our tested wells failed and could not be remediated. They were just out of luck. 74% required remediation, and of that remediation, 70% were resolved with a deeper pump and 30% with a deeper well. And then, another note, right? So our distribution of costs is continued to slant in the direction we saw earlier, right? So our domestic users, 84% of our tested wells, are now bearing only 58% of the change in costs. Similarly, our irrigation users, 5% of tested wells, are bearing 19% of the change in costs. But what I think is actually much more interesting than that is the change in the distribution costs. Now, for that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch back and forth between these two slides and just keep an eye on these pie charts and look at how the colors change, right? The dark colors and the light colors. Right? So what this is showing is that the impact here has switched from the cost type has switched on what's most important, what's most impactful. Lifting energy, right? The dark colors are now the majority component of the change in costs for everybody, for every use type, right? So whereas before at the 2010 depth to water, costs were 83% drilling, 13% lifting energy. The change in cost is only 29% drilling and 56% lifting energy. I personally find that very interesting for a number of reasons, but one potentially interesting reason is that we found that only 25% of this change in costs were eligible for that groundwater well assistance program I told you about. Why only 25%? Well, in part because our irrigation users are exempt from the program, but more than that, the groundwater well assistance program only compensates for drilling costs. It does not compensate at all for lifting energy costs. So we think it's probably fair to say that this policy intervention is actually misaligned with the most important impacts of this management decision in terms of depth to water. Okay, so we took it a little bit of a step further. We said, okay, well, we recognize that most of our wells tested here are domestic wells. And we're talking a lot about affordability, which, we can calculate like we did above from, what you're willing to pay for the water. But also for domestic wells, EPA gives us a metric for affordability, right? 2.5% of median household income. So what we did was we looked at how this change in cost impacted these wells by distributing those costs onto median household income by census tract. And what we found there was rather interesting. We found, first of all, that this change in depth to water under the desired future condition left 99% of our domestic wells affordable by this simple. Sorry, my headset goes dead when it doesn't hear anything for too long. We found that 99% of domestic wells were affordable by this simple median household income rule. But we know that this rule has been kind of criticized in part because median household income tends to obscure what's really going on, right? It's a median, right? It doesn't tell you much about, say, for example, the tails of income. So an increasingly common practice is to look at income brackets, and that's what we've done here, okay? So what we're seeing here is this is the $10,000 per year income bracket, 15, 25, 35, 50. And these results, I think, are really interesting. What this shows is that the change in the number of wells affordable to this income bracket, as I said before, we can't say for sure this well belongs to this person in this income bracket, but we can say this is how many wells would be affordable to this income bracket. The change in affordability for this income bracket from 2010 to the DFC has barely budged, right? If you're $50,000 a year, right, or more, there's a very small chance that your well is going to no longer be affordable at this DFC depth to water. But compare that to the other end of the spectrum. If you're in the $10,000 per year income bracket, at 2010 depth to water, there was about maybe 40 wells that were affordable for you. At the DFC depth to water, that number has plummeted by 92% to about 4. Right? So it's maybe fair to say that this DFC may be having disproportionate impacts in terms of domestic well affordability to our low income populations. Okay, so now we're getting short on time. I just kind of want to wrap up, conclude a little bit, talk about a few things, including how these methods could be expanded and operationalized. But before that, let me just kind of give you, I've been talking for a while, let me give you some key takeaways. Recoverability is not a one-size-fits-all issue, right? It's highly subjective. What are you willing to pay for the water? How much are you pumping, right? This is all variable, right? So there is no one-size-fits-all solution. But we can use tools like this to quantify how recoverability will change with a change in depth to water for known, estimated, or even potential uses. We can do that for existing infrastructure, or we can do that for model optimized well infrastructure. We can do that at either operational or affordability recovery thresholds. This gives us the ability to look at how planned or even unplanned, right, as might be caused by, say, drought, depth to water changes would impact recoverability. We can evaluate threats and opportunities, determine socioeconomic impacts, guide policy interventions to achieve maximum effect, like that GWAP program I mentioned, or even support sustainable management. Now, this current version of the model, it's not necessarily conclusive, right? There's all kinds of things you could do with it. You could implement more tailored drawdown solutions if you wanted to consider things like delayed gravity response, leaky confined systems, or even intersecting drawdown, if that's something you're interested in. We didn't talk about water quality at all, so you could perhaps integrate potable water depth limits to help address water quality as a limit to recoverability. You could also tweak the model, right, for your localized parameterization. Right? So for example, do you know more about what your user's pumping rate is or their pump power, right? There's subtle differences there in how the model would approach some of these calculations. And then finally, we have an interest in operationalizing this, right? We don't want to just leave it on, the bookshelves and the ivory towers of academia. We want people to be able to use these tools. And so for that, here at the Bureau of Economic Geology, we're actually working right now on developing a web-based user platform that would be as user-friendly and easy to use as possible for anybody from ma and pa with a well on their property all the way up to groundwater districts and management areas. You could enter parameters manually, or you could uplink certain data sets to the model. And then finally, you could connect these results to other economic models, right? We talk about the socioeconomic impacts of desired future conditions or other depth to water changes. And what we modeled here was changes in pumping costs, what I like to call direct socioeconomic impacts. But we recognize, of course, that if you're using a well to, say, irrigate crops or water livestock and your well fails and it can't be remediated and you can't water your livestock or irrigate your crops anymore, that's going to have additional socioeconomic impacts that aren't considered here. What you could do is you could use these tools or something like them as sort of a trigger point for when to deploy other economic models that look at those impacts specifically. And then finally, I want to talk briefly about the California connection. I figured there's a lot of folks in this audience that know a lot more about this than I do, so I didn't want to belabor it. But to me, when I read about the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, I understand you have these groundwater sustainability plans. And when I read them and I read about your measurable objectives, which seem very similar to desired future conditions to me and your minimum thresholds, that strikes me as depth to water-based management, right? So you could use the same tools that we've talked about here for desired future conditions, to look at these measurable objectives and minimum thresholds. You could do that to quantify, well, what exactly is a significant and unreasonable impact for at least 2 of your 6 sustainability indicators, increasing depth to water and reductions in storage. Is an increase in pumping costs of 50% unreasonable, 100% unreasonable, right? So that's kind of my thinking there, and I'd love to talk with you all more about that in our discussion time. Again, running short on time, so I want you to do my acknowledgments. My co-authors, Michael Young and Charlie Kreitler, the Texas Jackson School of Geosciences at the University of Texas at Austin, the Bureau of Economic Geology, which for those of you who aren't familiar, is a unit of the University of Texas, but is actually the state's geological survey. The State of Texas Advanced Resource Recovery Program, Planet Texas 2050, the BEG Excellence Fund for Water Research and Policy, and the Texas Water Resources Institute. And with that, I really appreciate you taking your lunch hour to sit with us and listen to me talk on and on and on. I really appreciate it, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.